Have you ever felt like you were offering your heart with both hands, only to watch it be received with silence? There's a particular kind of ache that only a woman who immured too deeply can recognize. That ache of trying to be enough in a world that never told her she already was. It doesn't start with a grand betrayal or a loud goodbye. It starts in the small moments, when you begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, you need to work harder to be loved. Louise Hay used to say, "Love is never outside of you. You are the love you've been waiting for." But when you've spent years in relationships where you gave everything and received crumbs, that truth feels distant, almost impossible. It's not just emotional exhaustion, it's spiritual confusion. Because somewhere deep down, you started to wonder, is it me? Is there something wrong with me? And even when you tried to convince yourself otherwise, the silence on the other end of the line said more than any words could. You see, many women carry this invisible wound, a belief formed in quiet pain that says, if I do more, give more, love more, maybe then I'll be seen. It's not something we say out loud. It's not even something we consciously admit, but it echoes in the way we stay a little too long in places that deplete us, in the way we check our phones hoping for a message from someone who stopped looking for us a long time ago. It lives in the silent deals we make with ourselves. If I can just be good enough, maybe he'll choose me. But what if I told you, the moment you stop begging for recognition, your energy changes. Imagine a flower blooming in the middle of a vast, empty field. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't seek validation. It simply opens, softly, fully, and that blooming, that wholeness, becomes its own magnet. That's the kind of energy that draws others in, not the performance, but the presence. Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls this the return to the wild soul, the part of you that knows, intuitively, that your value has nothing to do with who stays or who leaves. That wildness is not chaos. It's clarity. It's when a woman remembers herself so deeply that she no longer needs to chase what already belongs to her energetically. She becomes magnetic, not because she's trying to be, but because she has finally stopped trying. And when that shift happens, when a woman truly comes home to herself, something profound occurs. The same men who once overlooked her now feel uncertain in her presence. Not because she's playing games, but because she has become so deeply rooted in her own essence that nothing outside of her can define her worth anymore. There is nothing more attractive than peace. Peace with yourself, peace with your story, peace with your solitude. But how do we get there? What does it really mean to stop seeking and start radiating? And why is it that the moment we return to ourselves, the world starts to turn its face toward us differently? Now, we begin to walk deeper into that truth, the one that doesn't need to scream to be heard, the one that whispers in your quiet moments. You are not broken. You're just remembering who you truly are. And then, something quiet happens inside you, almost imperceptible at first. A stillness, a pause. You stop reaching for what doesn't reach back. You stop explaining yourself to someone who never truly listened. And in that pause, something sacred begins to grow, a magnetic field that no longer begs to be seen. You stopped pleading for love, and love began to respect you. That's where the true shift begins. There's a dignity in choosing silence over desperation. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of self-trust. It's not about giving up on connection. It's about ending the internal war that made you believe love had to be earned through suffering. You became irresistible the moment you chose not to chase, because a woman who no longer negotiates her worth becomes a mystery too sacred to be ignored. A man feels it. Even before he understands it, he feels it. Something in your energy tells him, she doesn't need me to complete her. She's already whole. And that truth, that quiet, unwavering truth, disarms him. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you're no longer trying to be gotten. You are not available to emotional bargains anymore. And that is a power he can't control. But this isn't about power over him. This is about power with yourself. Louise Hay once wrote, "I am enough exactly as I am." And when you say that with your presence, not just your words, the entire dynamic between you and the world begins to shift. You stop trying to be chosen. You start choosing. Choosing your peace. Choosing your standards. Choosing your time. That's when a new energy enters your life. The energy of reciprocity, of clarity, of men who know the value of presence because they feel it in yours. And for those who don't know how to honor it, they simply fall away, not because you pushed them, but because your silence spoke louder than your old need to explain. Let's go deeper now, into what it truly means to sit in silence, not from fear, but from sovereignty. Because not all silence is the same. There's the silence of pain, and the silence of power. There is a kind of silence that feels like punishment, a silence that echoes abandonment. That kind of silence, you've known too well. You sat with it, night after night, wondering what you did wrong. But there's another kind of silence, a sacred one, the silence of a woman who no longer needs to explain herself to be understood. The silence that comes when you've made peace with who you are, regardless of who stays or goes. This silence isn't cold. It's not indifference. It's sovereignty. It's the calm after the storm, the stillness that follows years of emotional noise. When you stop filling every space with apologies, with over-explanations, with trying to manage how others perceive you, you start to feel your own presence, fully. And that presence speaks louder than words ever could. Louise Hay reminds us, I am enough exactly as I am. Not when he texts back. Not when someone finally chooses you. Not when you lose 10 pounds or become more pleasing. Now, as you are. This silence becomes your shield and your song. It protects your energy. It honors your boundaries. It becomes the ground where your self-worth grows. A man feels that. He may not know why, but he feels different around you. He senses that he's not entering the space of a woman waiting to be saved, but of a woman who already rescued herself. And that disorients him, because he can't use the usual tools, guilt, charm, avoidance. They don't work when you're no longer trying to win someone who isn't playing. You see, when you no longer perform for love, love becomes something real, something rooted. You don't need to chase. You radiate. You don't need to convince. You become. And in that becoming, the right eyes see you, not because you asked to be seen, but because you were no longer hiding. Now let's touch something even deeper. The moment you stop seeking admiration and start admiring yourself. There's something quietly powerful about a woman who looks in the mirror and no longer searches for what's missing. A woman who no longer compares her reflection to someone else's standard. Who doesn't ask, am I good enough for him? But instead wonders, is he good enough to share space with this version of me? That shift is seismic, not loud, but life-changing. When you start admiring yourself, not for your appearance, not for your accomplishments, but for your essence, something in the atmosphere changes. You begin to glow with a kind of completeness that isn't dependent on being seen. You become your own witness, your own mirror, your own quiet applause. And that energy, that deep self-recognition, moves through you like light. It's not arrogance. It's healing. Because for too long, your admiration was outward. You gave your gaze, your longing, your approval to others first. You measured your worth through the reactions of men who barely knew how to hold space for their own hearts, let alone yours. And now you're reclaiming that gaze, redirecting it inward, learning that the way you look at yourself sets the tone for how others will. There is a calm that comes when you realize you are your own source. You stop dressing for someone else's attention. You stop dimming your laughter. You stop shrinking your dreams. Not because you want to intimidate, but because you're done negotiating your magnitude. And that kind of presence, a woman who walks with herself, who admires herself, who is loyal to her own soul, that's unforgettable. A man may not be able to name what's different about you, but he'll feel it. In how you carry your silence, in how you say less but mean more, in how you don't lean forward to be chosen. You lean back to see who shows up. And that subtle reversal, that quiet return to self, makes all the difference. But what happens when you're no longer trying to compete, not even with the ghosts of his past? What opens when you realize your only true competition was ever the version of you that kept waiting? There's a hidden kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly measuring yourself against what you think someone else wants, or worse, who someone else used to love. But when a woman stops that quiet war with comparison, something deeply beautiful returns to her. Her center, her rhythm, her essence. You're not here to outperform another woman's memory. You're not in a race with someone he once cherished or idealized. You're not meant to shrink just to fit into his unfinished past. You are not a replacement. You are a revelation. And when your energy is no longer scattered in invisible competitions, you become fully present. And that presence is powerful. The truth is, you inspire more when you're focused inward than when you're trying to be what someone else once loved. When you stop wondering if you're better than who came before, and start wondering if this man even honors the depth you now embody, the entire narrative changes. Your worth stops being a question. It becomes a statement. Men feel that shift. He may have been used to women trying to win him, adjusting, pleasing, proving, but now, he's faced with someone who simply exists in her own truth. You're not trying to replace anyone. You're not even in that arena. You're standing in a different field entirely, the field of self-knowledge, of sacred presence, of a woman who knows she's not here to compete, but to connect. And in that space, there is no room for manipulation, no room for emotional games, because you're no longer looking sideways. You're looking within, and that kind of gaze is rare. That kind of gaze is magnetic. But what truly sets you apart isn't just what you choose to focus on. It's what you're willing to walk away from, calmly, clearly, without fear. What happens when you can say no and still feel whole? There's a sacred kind of courage in a woman who can say no without trembling. Not because she's hardened, but because she's healed. There was a time when saying no felt like risking everything. His affection, his attention, even the illusion of connection. You said yes to things that didn't honor you, just to avoid the fear of being left behind. But now, that fear has a different name, self-betrayal, and you've stopped calling it love. When you say no from a place of self-respect, the ground beneath you doesn't shake. It settles. There's clarity in your voice, calm in your eyes, and what once felt like rejection now feels like protection, not from him, but from a version of you that didn't yet know her worth. A man can't help but notice when a woman is no longer emotionally available for manipulation, when her presence is not a given, when her energy is no longer up for negotiation. That no becomes a boundary, but more than that, it becomes an invitation for him to rise, to meet you in the space of truth, or to step away if he cannot. Because the woman who says no, without anger, without apology, without performance, she is rare. She is remembered. She's not trying to be unforgettable. She simply is, because she values her peace more than the chase. And in that stillness, she becomes deeply alluring. That's the paradox of emotional maturity. The less you try to be wanted, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're withholding, but because you are now full of self-trust, full of clarity, full of presence. And that fullness, that's what draws in the real. But it's not just about setting boundaries. It's about where you place your devotion. When your peace becomes your home, everything else, even the most passionate love, must align with that inner sanctuary. And if it doesn't, you know how to walk away. And this leads us to something even more vital, the realization that your center was never supposed to be him. Your center was always meant to be your soul. There's a turning point in every woman's story, the moment she decides that no relationship is worth losing her peace over, that her nights of overthinking, of tiptoeing around someone else's moods, of shrinking her needs to avoid conflict, are over. That's not bitterness. That's wisdom. It's the wisdom of someone who's finally come home to herself. When your peace becomes more precious than any passion, you stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop mistaking chaos for chemistry. You begin to recognize that the butterflies you once felt weren't love. They were anxiety. They were your soul whispering, "This isn't safe. This isn't steady." And when you honor that whisper, you begin to attract something entirely different, not because you're trying to, but because you've changed the frequency of your own presence. He senses it. The man who stands before you now feels it, even if he can't articulate it. There's something in your gaze, in your breath, in the way you no longer rush to fill silence with reassurance. He sees that you are not anchored in his validation. Your center lies elsewhere. It lies in your spirit, in your alignment, in the way you've made peace your home, not a prize to be won. And that changes everything, because now he can no longer predict you. He can't control you. He can't use your longing against you. You're not waiting. You're not chasing. You're not trying to be the exception to someone else's indifference. You are rooted. You are aware. You are in love with your own life. This isn't about rejecting love. It's about redefining it. It's about creating a space where love is free to grow, not because you need it, but because it's aligned with who you are now. And in that space, the right man will rise to meet you, or he will fall away. And either way, you'll remain whole. But there's another layer still, one even deeper. What happens when you no longer feel the need to prove your goodness? Because you finally remember that you were always enough. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when you no longer feel the urge to prove that you are worthy of being loved. You don't need to remind him of what you gave. You don't replay your kindness in hopes he'll finally see. You don't bring receipts for the loyalty, the patience, the hours spent holding what wasn't yours to carry. You simply stop. Because deep inside, something has healed. You've stopped performing goodness as a strategy. You've stopped confusing self-sacrifice with love. You've stopped asking, "What more can I do?" and started asking, "Why did I believe I had to do so much to be chosen?" And that shift, that return to your own dignity, changes everything. Louise Hay wrote, "I am worthy of love simply because I exist, not because you healed him, not because you waited, not because you made it easy, but because your very being, your breath, your spirit, your heart, is enough." And when you embody that, when that knowing sits quietly in your body like a calm fire, you no longer need to convince anyone to stay. A man may not understand it, but he will feel it. He will feel that he is no longer your source, that he's not standing in front of a woman waiting for rescue, but one who has already been rescued by herself. And that kind of presence, that kind of peace, either awakens the best in him or sends him searching elsewhere. Either way, you are free. And that freedom is the truest form of attraction. Not the kind that begs, but the kind that blesses. Not the kind that clings, but the kind that knows. If love is meant, it will recognize me without audition. If it's real, I won't have to suffer to keep it. And from that knowing, something powerful emerges. You no longer plead. You no longer persuade. You inspire. You become the kind of presence that shifts a room, that stirs a heart, that reminds a man of what depth really feels like. Not because you want him to change, but because you've changed. But now, let's go even further. What if the most magnetic thing about you isn't your beauty or your words, but the way you moved on without bitterness? There's something undeniably compelling about a woman who didn't just survive heartbreak. She alchemized it. Who didn't harden. Who didn't shut down. Who didn't lose herself in trying to make someone else stay. But instead, turned inward, healed, and rose. Not to prove anything, but because she knew her life was waiting to be lived, not paused for someone who couldn't see her worth. You inspire, not because you're perfect, but because you refuse to stay in a place where love was conditional. You inspire because you stopped begging, because you stopped rewriting yourself to be more digestible. You walked away with grace, with tears, yes, but also with truth. And in that quiet departure, you reclaimed something priceless. Your soul. Men feel that. They may not say it out loud, but something shifts in them when they sense your energy. The energy of a woman who chose herself, not out of spite, but out of sacred necessity, who decided to be whole, even if that meant walking through loneliness, who understood that temporary silence is better than constant self-abandonment. You didn't become distant. You became aligned. You didn't become cold. You became clear. And now, your presence speaks more than your pleas ever could. You don't ask, "Will he regret losing me?" Because you know, any man who cannot rise to meet the version of you that now exists was never meant to stay. And that knowing doesn't just protect you, it frees you. Because from that place, you no longer need to manipulate outcomes. You allow, you observe, you invite, but you no longer plead. And that makes your energy uncontainable. Some men will feel it and rise, others will feel it and run, and both are blessings. Because now you are the chooser, not the one waiting to be picked. Now you are the woman who loves with presence, not pressure, with openness, not need, with boundaries, not fear. And in that space of deep alignment, something else happens. You become the mirror, not for his ego, but for his soul. And that is where real transformation begins, not just in him, but in how you see yourself. Louise Hay once said, "There is nothing more powerful than a woman who loves herself." And maybe you didn't always know that kind of power. Maybe you learned love the hard way, through silence, through absence, through betrayal. But somewhere along the way, you stopped waiting for someone else to rewrite your story. You picked up the pen, and you began again. Because true magnetism doesn't come from how you dress, how you speak, or how perfectly you perform femininity. It comes from how deeply you've chosen yourself, especially when it would have been easier to be chosen by someone else. It comes from the quiet decisions, from the nights you cried and still chose not to text, from the mornings you woke up heavy and still chose to stand tall. It comes from the way you no longer betray your truth just to be loved. Clarissa Pinkola. Estes reminds us that the wild feminine isn't wild because she's untamed. She's wild because she's free. And the woman who returns to herself after being emotionally exiled is the most radiant force there is, not because she wants attention, but because she has become attention, present, rooted, alive in her own skin. The woman who is truly irresistible is not the one trying to be everything to everyone. She is the one who is willing to be fully herself, even if that means being too much for some, or not enough for others. She doesn't abandon herself to be understood. She doesn't dim to be digestible. She doesn't chase. She chooses. And here's the truth that might scare some. She doesn't need to be rescued, because she already rescued herself. She's not the woman he wants to conquer. She is the woman he fears losing, because when she walks away, she doesn't look back. So if you've been wondering what makes a woman truly unforgettable, it's not what she gives away. It's what she chooses to keep sacred: her peace, her power, her presence. And maybe that's the deepest truth of all. Irresistible isn't who tries the hardest. It's who finally stops trying, stops proving, stops performing. It's the woman who simply is. If this journey spoke to your heart, if you felt seen in these words, don't forget to subscribe, not just to this channel, but to your own unfolding. There is more waiting for you here. More depth, more clarity, more love. And if you're ready to go even deeper, click the next video on your screen. Your path to inner peace and emotional freedom continues there. You are not alone on this journey, and you are more powerful than you've ever been told.